The phone was ringing at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, when everything I thought I knew about respect, family, and recognition completely shattered. On the other end was a voice I'd only heard on international news broadcasts, and the words that followed would silence my mother-in-law's cutting remarks forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My hands were still trembling from the morning coffee as I sat in the cramped office space I'd converted from our garage 3 years earlier. The walls were lined with donation boxes, volunteer schedules, and photographs of communities we'd helped across rural Tennessee. Outside, I could hear Margaret's car pulling into our driveway with that familiar aggressive rumble of her aging Buick. Margaret Whitmore had been my mother-in-law for 8 years, and in that time, she'd perfected the art of making me feel insignificant without ever raising her voice. She had this way of tilting her head slightly when she spoke to me, as if she were explaining something obvious to a particularly slow child. Today would be no different. The garage door was still open when she walked in, her heels clicking against the concrete floor with military precision. She surveyed my workspace with those sharp blue eyes, taking in the handwritten signs, the second-hand desk I'd painted white to make it look more professional, and the collection of mason jars I used to sort donations by type. "Still playing house with your little charity project. I see," she said, her voice carrying that particular blend of amusement and condescension that had become her signature when addressing my work. She picked up one of our printed flyers, examining it like a specimen under a microscope. "Rebecca, honey, don't you think it's time you focused on something more substantial?" I'd learned long ago that engaging with Margaret's provocations only fed her satisfaction, but something about the way she dismissed 3 years of work with the phrase, "playing house," made my jaw clench involuntarily. The organization I'd built from nothing had already distributed over 40,000 pounds of food to families struggling with food insecurity across 3 counties. We'd established partnerships with local farms, coordinated with school districts to provide weekend meal programs, and created a network of volunteers that had grown from just me and my neighbor Sandra to over 200 committed community members. "We're actually preparing for our quarterly distribution event next week," I replied, keeping my voice steady as I continued organizing donor information sheets. "We're expecting to serve about 300 families this time." Margaret's laugh was sharp and brief. 300 families, she repeated, as if the number itself was amusing. "Rebecca, dear, real organizations don't operate out of converted garages. They have proper offices, professional staff, board meetings in actual conference rooms. What you're doing here is sweet, truly, but let's not pretend it's anything more than a hobby that makes you feel important." The words stung because they carried just enough truth to burrow under my skin. We didn't have a proper office. I did most of the administrative work alone, late at night after my day job at the insurance company. Our biggest piece of equipment was a borrowed pickup truck that my husband Jake used to collect donations from local grocery stores twice a week. By traditional standards, we were exactly what Margaret described, a small, scrappy operation held together by determination and duct tape. But Margaret hadn't seen Mrs. Patterson's face when we delivered groceries to her trailer after her husband lost his job at the plant. She hadn't watched 7-year-old Timothy Chun carefully counting out canned goods to take home to his siblings, while his mother worked her 3rd job of the week. She hadn't been there when Robert Jameson, a veteran struggling with PTSD and homelessness, broke down crying in our parking lot because someone had finally treated him with dignity instead of pity. "I know it doesn't look like much," I said, gesturing around the garage that had become my second home. "But the families we help don't care about conference rooms or professional letterhead. They care about having food on their tables and knowing that someone in their community sees their struggle and wants to help." Margaret set down the flyer and walked over to examine our volunteer wall. where I'd posted photos and thank you notes from the people we'd served. Her expression remained unchanged, that same polite skepticism she wore when discussing anything she considered beneath her notice. "That's exactly what I mean," she said, turning back to face me. "You're thinking too small, Rebecca. Your content to help a few hundred people in this little corner of Tennessee when you could be doing something that actually matters on a larger scale." My friend Diane's daughter works for a real nonprofit in Nashville. They have a staff of 50 people and handle millions of dollars in donations every year. That's the kind of impact that gets recognized, that gets respect. The comparison wasn't new. Margaret had been using Diane's daughter as a measuring stick for my inadequacy since the day I'd first mentioned starting the food bank. According to Margaret, Diane's daughter had graduated from Vanderbilt with a degree in nonprofit management, had been featured in Tennessee Magazine, and had been invited to speak at conferences across the Southeast. She was everything Margaret believed I should aspire to be, and everything she was convinced I'd never become. "What we're doing here has already made a real difference in people's lives," I said, hearing the defensive edge creeping into my voice despite my efforts to stay calm. "Last month alone, we prevented 12 families from having their utilities shut off because they could use their grocery money for other necessities. We've helped kids stay in sports programs because their parents didn't have to choose between buying uniforms and buying food. That matters, Margaret. That's the real impact." She nodded with the patience of someone humoring a child's elaborate fantasy. "Of course it matters to them, dear. But you have to understand the difference between helping a few people and actually changing systems. What you're doing is charity putting a bandage on a problem. Real organizations work to solve the root causes. They get funding from foundations, they influence policy, they create sustainable change." Margaret had a way of making her criticisms sound like gentle guidance, but I'd learned to recognize the steel beneath her velvet tone. She wasn't trying to help me improve my work. She was trying to convince me that my work wasn't worth improving. Every suggestion she made came with the underlying message that I was fundamentally unqualified for anything more ambitious than my current hobby. "Maybe you're right about the scale," I admitted, surprising myself with the concession. "But I'd rather help 300 families imperfectly than help no one while I spend years building the perfect organization." This seemed to amuse her even more. "Oh, Rebecca, that's such a lovely sentiment. Very admirable. But you know what happens to people who think small. They stay small. They spend their whole lives convinced that their little contribution matters, when they could have been part of something truly significant." She walked back toward the door, pausing to look at a photo on my desk, a picture from our first major distribution event, where I was standing next to Jake and our original team of volunteers, all of us grinning despite being exhausted after a 16-hour day of organizing and distributing food. In the background, you could see the long line of families waiting patiently for their turn, children playing between the cars while their parents filled out paperwork. "You look happy in this picture," Margaret observed, and for a moment, I thought she might say something encouraging. "That's the thing about playing pretend. It feels good while you're doing it. But eventually, the real world intrudes, and you realize you've been wasting time on make-believe when you could have been building something that actually lasts." With that, she clicked her way back to her car, leaving me alone in the garage that suddenly felt much smaller than it had an hour earlier. I sat down heavily in my second-hand office chair and stared at the photo she'd examined, trying to recapture the joy and purpose I'd felt that day. But Margaret's words had a way of seeping into the cracks of my confidence, making me question things I'd been certain about just moments before. Was I really making a difference, or was I just making myself feel better about problems I was too small to actually solve? Was there truth in her criticism that I was avoiding real challenges by focusing on work that felt manageable? Had I chosen this path because I genuinely wanted to help people, or because I was afraid to attempt something that might expose my limitations? The phone rang, interrupting my spiral of self-doubt. It was Sandra, calling to confirm the delivery schedule for next week's distribution event. As we talked through the logistics, I found myself seeing our operation through Margaret's eyes, the improvised systems, the borrowed equipment, the volunteers who showed up when they could but couldn't always commit to regular schedules. But I also heard something else in Sandra's voice. Excitement about the new partnerships we'd established with local farmers, pride in the streamlined process we developed for intake and distribution, and genuine affection for the families we'd come to know over the past 3 years. Whatever else our organization might lack, it wasn't lacking in heart or effectiveness within its chosen scope. Still, as I hung up the phone and returned to my paperwork, Margaret's words continued to echo, playing pretend, making believe, thinking too small. The labels stung because they carried just enough potential truth to make me wonder if I'd been lying to myself about the value of what I was building. Outside, I could hear the familiar sounds of our neighborhood coming to life, school buses rumbling down the street, dogs barking at joggers, the distant hum of morning traffic. It was the same soundtrack that had accompanied every morning of my work for the past 3 years, but today it felt different somehow, smaller, more ordinary. I had no way of knowing that in less than 18 hours, everything Margaret had said about my little charity project would be proven spectacularly wrong by a phone call that would change not just my perception of our work, but the entire trajectory of what we were building together. The confrontation with Margaret might have ended differently if Jake hadn't chosen that exact moment to come home for lunch. I heard his truck pull into the driveway just as I was finally managing to push her words out of my mind and focus on preparing donation receipts for our upcoming event. The timing couldn't have been worse or better, depending on how you looked at it. Jake walked into the garage with his usual easy smile, still wearing his work clothes from the construction site. His hands were clean, which meant he'd stopped to wash up before coming inside, probably anticipating grabbing a quick sandwich and heading back out. What he found instead was me sitting rigidly at my desk, staring at paperwork without really seeing it, and the lingering tension that Margaret always left in her wake. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Hey babe," he said, leaning down to kiss the top of my head. "How's the prep going for next week?" Then he paused, studying my face with the perceptiveness that had made me fall in love with him 12 years earlier. "What happened? You look like someone just told you Christmas was canceled." I considered brushing it off with some generic response about being tired or stressed about the upcoming distribution event. Jake had enough to worry about with his own job and the pressure of supporting both my charity work and our household expenses. The last thing he needed was to hear about another round of criticism from his mother, especially when I wasn't even sure how much of it might be justified. But something about the way he asked, with genuine concern rather than polite inquiry, made the whole story come tumbling out. I told him about Margaret's visit, her dismissive comments about playing house and make-believe, her comparisons to Diane's daughter, and her suggestions that I was wasting time on work that didn't really matter in the larger scheme of things. Jake's expression grew progressively darker as I talked. By the time I finished recounting Margaret's parting shot about playing pretend, his jaw was set in a way I recognized from the rare occasions when his normally easygoing nature encountered something that genuinely angered him. "She said what now?" he asked, his voice carrying a dangerous quiet that I'd heard maybe 3 times in our entire relationship. "She called your work playing pretend?" I nodded, suddenly feeling protective of Margaret despite my own hurt feelings. "She didn't mean it maliciously, Jake. She just thinks I could be doing something more significant." "Becca," Jake said, sitting down on the folding chair we kept for volunteers, "do you remember what this place looked like when Tommy Martinez's family lost their apartment last winter?" The memory was vivid. Tommy's mother, Elena, had shown up at our regular distribution with her 3 young children, all of them carrying everything they owned in garbage bags and backpacks. They'd been evicted when Elena's hours got cut at the restaurant where she worked, and they were sleeping in their car while trying to save enough money for a deposit on a new place. You didn't just give them food, Jake continued. You coordinated with the church to find them temporary housing. You helped Elena write a resume. You connected her with the job training program at the community college, and you organized a furniture drive when they finally got approved for that apartment on Maple Street. Tommy's kids are in the same school district now because of what you did. That's not playing pretend, Becca. That's changing lives. Jake stood up and walked over to our volunteer wall, pointing to a photo I'd almost forgotten about Elena and her children at our spring picnic, all 4 of them beaming at the camera. Elena was wearing scrubs from her new job at the medical clinic, and Tommy was holding a certificate from his school's honor roll. Mom sees numbers and official recognition and thinks that's what makes something real, Jake said. But she's never been hungry. She's never had to choose between buying groceries and buying her kids' school supplies. She doesn't understand that for the people we help, this organization isn't a hobby or a charity project, it's a lifeline. His words were reassuring, but they also highlighted something that had been bothering me since Margaret's visit. Jake believed in our work completely, but his faith was based on love and loyalty as much as objective assessment. How could I be sure he wasn't just telling me what I needed to hear? But what if she's right about the scale? I asked. What if we're thinking too small? What if we could be helping thousands of people instead of hundreds? Jake was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the same thoughtfulness he brought to complex construction problems. You know what I think? He finally said. I think there's room in the world for both kinds of organizations. The big ones that tackle systemic issues, and the small ones that catch the people who fall through the cracks. And right now in this community, we're the ones catching people. Before I could respond, we heard Margaret's Buick pulling back into the driveway. Jake and I exchanged glances. She'd been gone for less than 2 hours, which was unusual for her. Typically, when Margaret made her surprise visits, she'd disappear for the rest of the day, satisfied that she'd delivered whatever message she'd come to share. This time, she walked into the garage with a different energy entirely, where her morning visit had been characterized by condescending amusement. This return carried the sharp focus of someone with a specific agenda. She was carrying a manila folder and wore the expression of a person who'd just discovered something important. Rebecca, dear, I've been thinking about our conversation this morning, she said, her tone brisk and businesslike. And I realized I haven't been entirely fair in my assessment of your situation here. Jake raised an eyebrow. Your situation. Mom, Margaret ignored him, focusing her attention entirely on me. I made some phone calls this afternoon, just to get a better understanding of what legitimate food assistance organizations look like in this region. I spoke with the director of the Second Harvest Food Bank in Nashville, and I have to say, the contrast is quite illuminating. She opened her manila folder and pulled out several printed pages, what looked like financial reports, organizational charts, and promotional materials. The professional quality of the documents made our handmade flyers and photocopied forms look amateur by comparison. Second Harvest distributed over 47 million pounds of food last year. Margaret continued, spreading the papers across my desk like evidence in a court case. They have relationships with major corporate donors, federal funding, a professional development staff, and partnerships with over 800 agencies across Middle Tennessee. I could feel Jake tensing beside me, but Margaret wasn't finished. They operate out of a 60,000 square foot warehouse, Rebecca. They have refrigerated trucks, computerized inventory systems, and a board of directors that includes CEOs from major corporations and prominent community leaders. That's what a real food assistance organization looks like. The comparison was overwhelming in its stark contrast to our garage operation. £47 million versus our 40,000. 800 partner agencies versus our handful of local connections. Professional staff versus me working nights and weekends around my day job. "I'm not telling you this to be cruel," Margaret said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "I'm telling you because I think you deserve to understand the difference between what you're doing and what actually moves the needle on food insecurity in this region." Jake stepped forward, his patience finally exhausted. "Mom, what exactly are you trying to accomplish here?" Margaret straightened, meeting her son's challenging gaze with cool composure. "I'm trying to help Rebecca understand that good intentions aren't enough. That if she really cares about helping people, she should be working with organizations that have the resources and expertise to make a real difference instead of pretending that this garage operation is anything more than a feel-good hobby." The word pretending hung in the air like a challenge. I felt something shift inside me, not the self-doubt that Margaret's morning visit had triggered, but something sharper and more determined. Maybe it was Jake's unwavering support, or maybe it was the realization that Margaret's criticism had crossed from constructive feedback into something more personal and undermining. "You're right about the scale," I said quietly, standing up from my desk chair. "Second Harvest does incredible work, and they help far more people than we ever could. But they're not here, Margaret. They don't know Mrs. Patterson or the Martinez family or any of the other people who come to our distributions. They don't have time to sit with someone while they fill out applications for assistance programs, or to drive across town to deliver groceries to someone who doesn't have transportation." Margaret's expression remained unchanged, but I could see Jake nodding encouragingly out of the corner of my eye. "We're not trying to be Second Harvest," I continued. "We're trying to be what our community needs us to be. And maybe that's smaller and less impressive than what you think I should be doing, but it's real work that makes a real difference in real people's lives." Margaret closed her folder with a sharp snap. "Well," she said, "I suppose we'll have to agree to disagree about what constitutes real work in this context." She turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Just remember, Rebecca, that when you're ready to stop playing in your garage and do something that actually matters, there are organizations out there that could use someone with your enthusiasm." After she left, Jake and I stood in the sudden quiet of the garage, surrounded by the evidence of 3 years of work that Margaret had just systematically dismissed as inadequate. The professional materials she'd left behind seemed to mock our humble operation with their glossy finish and impressive statistics. But as I looked around at our volunteer wall, our donation bins, and our carefully organized systems, I realized something important had shifted. Margaret's escalating criticism had forced me to articulate something I'd been feeling but hadn't fully understood. Our organization's value wasn't diminished by its small scale, and our impact wasn't less meaningful because it was local and personal. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, including the massive distribution event we'd been planning for weeks. But tonight, for the first time since Margaret's morning visit, I felt certain that what we were doing mattered, regardless of whether anyone else understood or respected it. Thursday morning arrived with the kind of relentless rain that transforms simple tasks into complex logistics problems. Our quarterly distribution event was scheduled to begin at 9 a.m., and by 6:30 I was already standing in the community center parking lot watching puddles form where we'd planned to set up our outdoor stations. The community center had been our venue for the past year and a half, ever since we'd outgrown the church fellowship hall. Pastor Williams had been generous with the space, asking only that we cover the utilities and help with cleanup afterward. It wasn't glamorous. The building dated back to the 1970s and showed its age in everything from the flickering fluorescent lights to the temperamental heating system, but it was large enough for our needs and centrally located for the families we served. Sandra, arrived just as I was mentally redesigning our entire setup to work indoors. She took one look at the weather and the expression on my face and immediately started problem solving, the way she had been doing since she'd volunteered to help with our very first distribution 3 years earlier. "We can move the check-in tables into the main hall," she said, already pulling supplies from her van. "The food stations can go in the side rooms, and we'll use the kitchen area for the fresh produce. It'll be tighter than usual, but it'll work." Sandra had a gift for making complicated situations seem manageable. She was retired from a career in event planning, and her organizational skills had been invaluable as our operation had grown. More importantly, she had an unshakable faith in our mission that had sustained me through more moments of doubt than I cared to count. By 8 a.m., we had a team of 15 volunteers transforming the community center into an efficient distribution hub. Tables appeared in logical arrangements, signs went up directing traffic flow, and the food donations that had been accumulating in my garage for weeks were sorted into categories and arranged for easy access. It should have been a routine setup, the kind of organized chaos that had become familiar over dozens of previous events. But something felt different about this distribution day. Maybe it was Margaret's criticism still echoing in my head, or maybe it was the added pressure of knowing that several new volunteers would be observing our operation for the first time. Whatever the cause, I found myself seeing everything through a more critical lens. The folding tables we used looked tired and mismatched. Our handwritten signs, which had always seemed charmingly personal, now appeared unprofessional next to the printed materials I'd seen from Second Harvest. The community center itself, with its worn carpeting and outdated fixtures, suddenly felt like exactly what Margaret had called it, a small-time operation trying to punch above its weight. "Rebecca, we've got a problem with the refrigerated items," called out Maria Santos, one of our newer volunteers. She was standing next to 3 large coolers that contained dairy products, fresh meat, and produce that required temperature control. "The ice is melting faster than expected, and we don't have access to the community center's refrigerator until 9. This was exactly the kind of logistical challenge that larger organizations with proper facilities and equipment wouldn't face. I could practically hear Margaret's voice pointing out how a real food bank would have refrigerated trucks and cold storage capabilities that eliminated these amateur hour problems. "Let me call Peterson's Market," I said, pulling out my phone. "They've helped us before with emergency refrigeration." But when I reached Dave Peterson, the store owner who had been one of our most reliable supporters, I got news that made my stomach drop. His walk-in cooler had broken down the night before, and he was dealing with his own crisis trying to prevent thousands of dollars worth of inventory from spoiling. "I'm really sorry, Rebecca," Dave said, and I could hear the genuine regret in his voice. "Any other day, you know I'd help you out. But I've got a repair technician coming this morning, and I can't take on anything else right now." I hung up and looked at Sandra, who had been listening to my half of the conversation with growing concern. We had about 45 minutes before families would start arriving, and roughly $300 worth of perishable food that might be unsafe to distribute if we couldn't keep it properly chilled. "What about the church?" Sandra suggested. "Pastor Williams has that big refrigerator in the kitchen." It was worth a try, but when I called, I learned that the church was hosting a funeral reception that morning, and their kitchen facilities were fully occupied. 2 more calls to other potential partners yielded similar results. Everyone who might normally help was dealing with their own Thursday morning emergencies. Standing in the community center lobby with melting ice and mounting pressure, I felt Margaret's words from the day before taking on a prophetic quality. This was exactly what she'd been talking about, the difference between a professional operation with redundant systems and contingency plans and a grassroots organization held together by goodwill and prayer. "We're not going to be able to distribute the refrigerated items safely," I told Sandra and the other volunteers who had gathered around us. I think we need to focus on shelf-stable food and see if we can reschedule people who were specifically counting on the meat and dairy products. The disappointment in the room was palpable. Several volunteers had gotten up before dawn to help with this distribution, and some of the families we served had rearranged work schedules or found babysitters specifically to attend. The idea of turning people away or providing less than we'd promised felt like a fundamental failure of our mission. That's when Tommy Martinez appeared in the doorway, shaking rain from his jacket. Tommy was Elena's oldest son, the same kid whose family we'd helped through their housing crisis the previous winter. He was 16 now, tall and lanky with his mother's determined expression and a work ethic that had impressed everyone who met him. "Ms. Rebecca," he said, walking over to where we were huddled around the melting coolers. "Mom sent me to help with setup, but it looks like you guys are dealing with something." I explained the refrigeration problem, expecting sympathy, but not expecting much practical help from a teenager. But Tommy listened intently, then pulled out his phone and started making calls in rapid Spanish. After a few minutes of animated conversation, he hung up and grinned. "My Uncle Carlos owns a catering truck," he said. "It's got full refrigeration, and he's not using it today because of the rain. He said he can be here in 20 minutes if you want to move the cold stuff into his truck." The relief was immediate and overwhelming. Carlos arrived exactly when he'd promised, driving a gleaming food truck equipped with commercial-grade refrigeration units. He refused to accept any payment for the favor, saying only that Elena had told him how much our organization had meant to their family during their difficult time. As we transferred the perishable items into Carlos's truck, I realized something important was happening. This crisis had revealed not the weakness of our grassroots approach, but its greatest strength. We didn't have corporate partnerships or professional equipment, but we had something else: relationships built on mutual support and genuine care. By 9 a.m., we were ready. The rain had stopped, families were beginning to arrive, and our volunteers were positioned at their stations with the confidence that comes from successfully navigating unexpected challenges. The setup might not have looked like the professional operation Margaret admired, but it was functioning exactly as intended. The first family through our check-in was the Hendersons, a young couple with twin toddlers who had been attending our distributions for about 6 months. Mrs. Henderson worked part-time at a daycare center while finishing her nursing degree, and her husband was between jobs after the factory where he'd worked for 8 years had downsized. "Thank you so much for doing this," Mrs. Henderson said as she filled out her intake form. "I don't know what we'd do without you guys. The food assistance office downtown makes you wait in line for 3 hours, and they're only open when I'm supposed to be in class." Her comment struck me as particularly relevant given Margaret's criticism about thinking too small. The large, established food assistance programs in our region were undoubtedly helping more people than we were, but they couldn't provide the flexibility and personal attention that made the difference for families like the Hendersons. As the morning progressed, I watched our volunteers interacting with the families we served and realized that Margaret had missed something crucial in her assessment of our work. She saw inefficiency where I saw relationships. She saw unprofessionalism where I saw accessibility. She saw a small scale where I saw a human scale. By noon, we had served 347 families, our largest distribution ever. The final count included 1,247 individuals, from newborn babies to senior citizens, representing every demographic in our county. More importantly, we had handled a significant logistical crisis without compromising our service or turning anyone away. But as we began cleaning up and packing away supplies, I couldn't shake the feeling that this success was fragile. What would happen when we faced a crisis that couldn't be solved by community connections and improvised solutions? What would happen if Margaret's predictions about our limitations proved accurate when the stakes were higher. I had no way of knowing that within 18 hours, those questions would become irrelevant, replaced by a phone call that would fundamentally change not just how others saw our work, but how the world understood the value of community-based. Organizations like ours. The phone call came at 6:47 a.m. on Friday morning, exactly 24 hours after our successful distribution event. I was in the kitchen making coffee when the landline rang with that particular urgency that early morning calls always carry. Jake was already at the construction site, so I assumed it was either an emergency or a wrong number. The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, and completely unfamiliar. "Is this Rebecca Chun, director of the Riverside Community Food Initiative?" I almost corrected her. We'd never used such a formal title for our organization, and I'd certainly never called myself a director. But something about the caller's tone made me hesitate. "Yes, this is Rebecca." "Ms. Chun, this is Patricia Williams calling from the office of UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. I hope I'm not calling too early, but we have a time-sensitive matter to discuss with you." The words didn't compute immediately. UN Secretary General, the United Nations, calling me at 6:47 a.m. on a Friday morning in rural Tennessee. I must have misheard something. "I'm sorry, could you repeat that?" I asked, certain I'd misunderstood. "This is Patricia Williams from the United Nations headquarters in New York. Secretary General Guterres would like to speak with you directly about your organization's innovative approach to community-based food security. Are you available to take his call this morning?" The coffee mug in my hand was suddenly trembling. This had to be some kind of mistake, a wrong number, a case of mistaken identity, or possibly an elaborate prank. Organizations like ours didn't get phone calls from the United Nations. We didn't get phone calls from anyone more official than the county health department. "I think there might be some confusion," I said slowly. "Our organization is very small. We operate out of a converted garage in Tennessee. I think you might be looking for someone else." Patricia's laugh was warm and reassuring. "Ms. Chun, there's no confusion. Your work has come to our attention through some very specific channels, and the Secretary General is quite interested in discussing it with you. Would 10 a.m. Eastern Time work for your schedule?" I found myself agreeing before my rational mind could process what was happening. After I hung up, I stood in my kitchen staring at the phone, wondering if I'd just imagined the entire conversation. The United Nations Secretary General wanted to talk to me about our garage-based food distribution operation. It seemed impossible. At exactly 10 a.m., the phone rang again. This time, the voice that greeted me carried the distinctive accent and measured cadence that I'd heard in countless news broadcasts over the years. "Ms. Chun, this is Antonio Guterres. Thank you for making time to speak with me today." The surreal nature of the moment hit me fully. I was standing in my kitchen, still wearing my pajamas, talking to one of the most influential people in international humanitarian work. The Secretary General of the United Nations was calling me while I looked out at the converted garage where Margaret had dismissed my work as playing pretend just 3 days earlier. "Secretary General Guterres," I managed. "I have to say, I'm completely surprised by this call. I'm not sure how our little organization came to your attention." "Ms. Chun, let me explain," he said, and I could hear genuine warmth in his voice. 3 weeks ago, I received a report from our regional coordinator for sustainable development in North America. She had been researching innovative approaches to food security at the community level, and your organization was highlighted as an exceptional example of locally driven solutions that achieve remarkable efficiency and impact. He paused, and I heard papers rustling in the background. "According to our analysis, your organization serves approximately 1,400 individuals per quarter, with an operational budget that represents less than 2% of what comparable programs spend per person served. More importantly, your retention and satisfaction metrics indicate that families who receive assistance through your program achieve food security stability at rates significantly higher than those served by larger institutional programs. The numbers he was citing were more detailed than any analysis we'd ever done of our own work. Someone at the United Nations had been studying our operation with a level of scrutiny that we'd never applied to ourselves. Ms. Chun, the reason I'm calling personally is that the United Nations is launching a new initiative focused on replicating successful community-based approaches to food security in underserved regions worldwide. We're looking for model programs that demonstrate how local organizations can achieve significant impact with limited resources. And your work has been identified as exactly the kind of innovation we want to support and scale. The irony was so complete, it took my breath away. While Margaret had been criticizing us for thinking too small and playing pretend, the United Nations had been analyzing our work as a model for global replication. While she'd been comparing us unfavorably to large institutional programs, international development experts had been studying us as an example of what those larger programs should aspire to become. I have to ask, I said, still trying to process the magnitude of what he was telling me. How did you find out about us? We've never applied for any international recognition or submitted reports to any UN agencies. Secretary General Buters chuckled. Ms. Chun, effective humanitarian work has a way of being noticed, even when it happens quietly. One of our field coordinators was visiting family in your region last month and attended your distribution event. She was so impressed by what she observed that she wrote a detailed report recommending that we study your model more closely. He continued, what impressed her most wasn't just your efficiency or your impact metrics, though both are remarkable. It was the relationship she observed between your volunteers and the families you serve. She noted that people weren't just receiving food assistance, they were receiving dignity, personal attention, and wraparound support that addressed underlying causes of food insecurity. Everything he was describing sounded like our normal operations, but hearing it reflected back through the lens of international humanitarian standards made me realize that what felt routine to us was actually quite exceptional. We'd been so focused on simply meeting our community's needs that we'd never recognized the broader significance of how we were meeting those needs. Ms. Chun, I'd like to invite you to participate in our Global Food Security Summit in New York next month. We'd like you to present your model to representatives from humanitarian organizations worldwide, and we'd like to discuss how the UN can support the replication of your approach in other communities. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, covering details about the summit, the potential for international collaboration, and the UN's interest in developing a formal partnership with our organization. By the time we hung up, my small community food bank had been transformed from Margaret's garage hobby into an internationally recognized model for innovative humanitarian work. I sat in my kitchen for a long time after the call ended, trying to reconcile this new reality with the criticism I'd been absorbing for days. The same work that Margaret had dismissed as inadequate and amateur had caught the attention of global humanitarian leaders who saw it as revolutionary and worthy of worldwide replication. When Jake came home for lunch, I told him about the morning's phone calls. His reaction was immediate and jubilant. He swept me into a bear hug and spun me around the kitchen, whooping with pride and vindication. But even in his excitement, I could see him processing the same irony that had struck me. Wait until Mom hears about this, he said, grinning with the satisfaction of someone whose faith had been spectacularly vindicated. That afternoon, Margaret called to check on how our distribution event had gone. I let her finish her usual polite inquiries before mentioning that I'd received an interesting phone call that morning. Oh? She said with the tone she used when she was being patient with what she expected to be inconsequential news. The UN Secretary General called, I said simply. He wants our organization to present our model at a global humanitarian summit next month. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that I wondered if the call had been dropped. When Margaret finally spoke, her voice carried a stunned quality I'd never heard before. "The United Nations Secretary General called you? About your ... about the food bank? About our innovative approach to community-based food security," I said, using his exact words. "Apparently, we've been identified as a model program for global replication." Another long silence. Then, in a voice much smaller than her usual, authoritative tone, "Well, that's quite remarkable, Rebecca. I had no idea that what you were doing was... I never realized the broader significance." For the first time in 8 years, Margaret Whitmore was at a loss for words. The work she'd dismissed as playing pretend had been recognized by international, humanitarian leaders as genuinely groundbreaking. The small scale she'd criticized as inadequate had been identified as precisely what made our approach scalable and replicable worldwide. 3 months later, I stood in the UN headquarters in New York, presenting our community food bank model to representatives from 68 countries. The garage that Margaret had seen as a symbol of our limitations had become the birthplace of an approach that was being implemented in communities from rural Kenya to urban Philippines. Margaret attended my presentation via livestream. Afterward, she called to congratulate me, and for the first time in our relationship, I heard something in her voice I'd never heard before: genuine respect. "Rebecca," she said, "I owe you an apology. I was wrong about what you were building. And I was wrong about what constitutes meaningful work. What you've accomplished is extraordinary." The phone call that changed everything hadn't just validated our work, it had transformed how our family understood the difference between recognition and impact, between scale and significance, and between playing pretend and changing the world. One community at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.